You already know the monster. The warlord who executed 7,000 of his own people for not crying hard enough at his mother's funeral. The killing machine who made his soldiers dance barefoot on thorns and butchered anyone who flinched. The Black Napoleon who dreamed up a whole new way of war and drowned half a continent in blood. Great story, right? Yeah, there's just one problem. Almost all of it traces back to two young European traders. And get this, one of them literally wrote to the other, telling him to make the Zulu kings as bloodthirsty as you can. Sold more books that way. And made it a whole lot easier to justify taking the land. So, this is the rise and fall of Shaka Zulu, a real king, knifed to death by his own brothers. But it's also the story of a second killing, the one done with a pen after he was already in the ground. Okay, let's start with what we can actually stand on. Around 1787, a boy is born to a minor Zulu chief named Senzanga Kona and a woman named Nandi from a neighboring clan. The union breaks custom, so the shame lands on the kid. He and his mother get pushed out, shunned, passed from place to place, treated like dirt. Now, you'll hear that this scarred, fatherless kid was basically destined to become a tyrant. Yeah, be careful with that one. That neat little origin story, mostly cooked up by a novel written a century later. What we can actually say is simpler. He grew up an outsider in a world turning violent, because something was changing on those green hills. Small chiefdoms were being welded into bigger, hungrier ones, drilled for real war instead of ritual skirmish. The man doing it near Shaka was a paramount chief named Dingiswayo. And as a young warrior in Dingiswayo's army, Shaka was good, disciplined, fearless, noticed. When his father died around 1816, Dingiswayo lent him the soldiers to seize the Zulu chieftaincy. The clan he took over was tiny, maybe a few thousand people. Nobody watching would have called it an empire. Not yet. Then his patron, Dingiswayo, was killed by a rival king, Zwide of the Ndwandwe, and the balance of power collapsed into open war. Now here's where the legend really takes off. Shaka the genius, supposedly, single-handedly reinvented war. A short stabbing spear he forged himself, a buffalo horns formation he dreamed up, an army he conjured out of nothing. Yeah, about that. Here's what the historians who actually dug in found. The short spear already existed. The encircling formation? Ancient. Hannibal pulled a version of it on Rome, 2,000 years earlier. The regiment system? It was spreading across the whole region, before Shaka ever held power. So what did he do? He took every one of those pieces and organized them, harder and colder than anyone around him. He turned loose war bands into a standing army that belonged to the king. Weapons, shields, even the right to marry, all controlled from the top, all bent toward war. He didn't invent the tools, he built the machine, and the machine worked. He broke Zwide. But understand what broke actually means here. And look, this is not spears tossed politely from a distance and a few dramatic falls. Shaka's men were drilled to sprint into the gap, hook the enemy's shield aside with their own, and punch the broad blade up under the ribs. Close enough to feel the breath go out of a man. You did it, pulled the spear free with that wet, sucking drag, and you did it to the next one, until the grass was slick and a whole field went silent. Afterwards, the warriors had a name for the grim ritual of cleaning the blood from the iron. They called it washing the spears. He absorbed the defeated, their cattle, their young men, their fighting strength, into a growing Zulu kingdom that swallowed 100 chiefdoms and more. By the mid-1820s, he was the most powerful man for hundreds of miles. and the red work of his regiments had carried his name far ahead of them, like a smell on the wind. It's also when the outside world first reached him. In 1824, a handful of British traders reached his court. One even helped nurse him after an assassin's blade found him. Remember these two. They're about to become the most important people in this whole story. Not for what they did to Shaka, but for what they'd write about him. Then, in October 1827, the one person he never ruled over died. His mother, Nandi. Not by his hand, by the way, that's a myth. She fell sick, probably dysentery, and just like that, she was gone. And the king came apart. The sources describe a grief that curdled into horror. Mourning was forced on an entire nation. Crops were left to rot in the ground. And, by these accounts, the executioners moved through the crowds at the royal kraal, clubbing and spearing anyone with a dry eye, real or imagined, until the dead lay in heaps and the living wailed louder out of sheer terror. The number they give is 7,000. We can't verify it. It traces straight back to the men who had every reason to inflate it. But strip the body count away, and something real remains. The disciplined, calculating king had lost the thread. And now, even standing near him could get you killed. The army was sent off on longer and longer campaigns, exhausted, resentful. And at the center of the kingdom, the people closest to him began to whisper. September 1828. His army's away in the north, and two of his half-brothers, Dingane and Mhlangana, walk right up to him, a trusted servant at their side. The first blade went in from behind, then another, and another. The Iklua his own kingdom was built on turned on the man who made it law. They say he staggered and looked at them and asked what was wrong, as the dust under him went dark and wet. The most feared man in southern Africa dropped in the open by his own blood, begging at the end to understand. His body, the records say, was dumped into an empty grain pit and covered over like spoiled meat. There's a famous line they put in his mouth as he fell, a prophecy that it would not be his brothers who ruled this land, but the white men coming like swallows. It's a haunting piece of theatre. It's also almost certainly made up later, written once that conquest had actually happened. The truth is plainer and sadder. The kingdom he spent his life building passed, that same night, to the men who had just murdered him. But the knife was only the first death. The second one took longer, because the Shaka most of the world remembers wasn't really shaped at that grain pit. He was shaped at a writing desk. Those traders sold the tale of an insane, blood-soaked savage, by their own admission, dialed up to sell. And later, much later, that monster became useful. As white settlers pushed into the interior, a story took hold. That Shaka's wars had emptied the land, a great crushing, a wave of death that left the country bare and waiting. It even got a name. Trouble is, the empty part was wildly overstated. The violence of that era was real, but it came from many directions at once: drought, trade, and Europeans pressing in from both coasts, not from one African king conjuring a genocide. Much of the so-called depopulation was people fleeing and surviving, not dying. Historians still argue over how much was real and how much was alibi. But that argument is the honest answer. They threw the greatest king in the land into a pit dug for grain and smoothed the earth over him. No monument, no marked grave. Within weeks, his own killers had turned on each other for the throne he left warm. But the body in the pit was the smaller death, because the men with the pens were only getting started. They took a real king, brilliant, brutal, gutted by grief, and they boiled him down to a single word: monster. Make him as bloodthirsty as you can. It's sold, and a monster is a useful thing to own. Because once you've decided one man drowned this whole land in blood and left it empty, you never have to call it stealing when you take it. You're just filling the silence he left behind. So Shaka was killed twice, once with iron in the daylight by his brothers, once with ink in the dark by men who needed the blood to run deeper than it ever did. The spear wound closed in an afternoon. The other one never has.